In this video, I talk about 4 mini painting principles that I wish I knew when I started. So as I paint this troll miniature, I won't go necessarily into techniques and stuff like that, but concepts that you can use to make your minis even better. So let's start with... Just to give you some context, this miniature is about 10 centimeters. Usually I don't really paint models this big, and as you'll see later, the 4 principles will help me tackle it. So what is saturation? The easiest way to explain it is to put this picture into Photoshop and push the scale to both sides. Pushing it left makes the photo desaturated, which means it loses all the color. And if I push it right, it becomes very vibrant, saturated and colorful. Maybe even annoyingly so. And while you don't want to make your miniatures as saturated as celebrity news photos, it's still nice to have vibrant result rather than something dull. So for me, at the very least, I decided to have the skin of the troll quite saturated. So I started with a base coat of amethyst purple. This color looks quite nice, and maybe you might think it's too light, but acrylics also get darker once they are fully dry. Overall, I wanted to capture more of a fairy tale vibe with this miniature, and using highly saturated paints will help me get there. I guess I could aim for more realistic result, but just look at this guy and his sad face. It's f***ing cartoonish. Still, you'll see that not everything on this mini is gonna be as vibrant. Otherwise, it would be straight up clown fiesta. I'll talk about this more a bit later, but the most saturated stuff is also gonna be the center of attention. As I paint this hammer, I wanna expand on something that people usually don't think about, but they know it subconsciously. So let me ask you, what determines the perceived color of anything? So for example, I painted this hammer with dark sea blue, so you could say that it's gonna lean into blue. But you are a smart guy, you have seen the result already, so you know it's in fact gonna be green. However, this hammer could still quite easily lean into teal, blue or purple. If your base coat is dark enough, it usually doesn't determine the perceived color. The color that determines that is found in midtones. If you've ever tried to paint non-metallic metal on a sword or something, usually people tell you to not use only black and white, but to add some color. You can have a very dark shades like straight up black and very light highlights, even white. But if you work with colors in the midtones, it's still gonna read as those colors. Now keep that in mind as I work on this hammer, but there is another principle that's starting to emerge. All materials are a bit different, and you don't have to actively try to differentiate them all, but on this troll mini I feel like it helps a lot. Given that the hammer in the hands of this troll is a weapon of mass destruction, it only makes sense for it to be weathered and kinda battered. So on the edges I make sure that the edge highlights are not a straight line by adding some dots and other irregularities. Adding more different colors is also a great way to make it look dirty from the environment and all kinds of debris and shit. For the most part, those are the only 2 methods that I have used to add different textures on this mini. And sure, you could use streaking grime or oil paints and just drown your mini in it, but I find it much better for scale models or army painting. Focusing on different brushstrokes and adding various colors is much more controlled way to do this. And I even demonstrated that in one of my videos on weathering. This kinda weathered finish is not the only texture in here, however. I thought about different materials and how they'll be influenced by everything. So when it came to this gold handle, I made it much smoother than the head of the hammer. My assumption is that this troll is using it a lot, so it won't be extra polished, but there is notable difference between these parts since the head is much more exposed to damage. It also helps that the handle is not super light and saturated, because it's not exactly the point of interest on this mini. And if you're asking where is this model from, well, it's from today's sponsor, Evernight. Evernight Battlegrounds is a Kickstarter campaign where you can get 10 very unique miniatures in 75mm scale. Now, funnily enough, I painted throughout the troll with this kind of fairy tale vibe in mind, but in fact, most of the miniatures have a grim and gloomy lore. For example, you have your Necromancer, Lord of the Undead, a very scary looking rat, or even a combat plague doctor of all things. These minis are fantastic if you are looking into painting something bigger than a gaming scale model, because they have a good ratio of details and free spaces that allow you to express yourself. Obviously, I enjoyed painting the model exactly for this reason, but also people like John from the channel Miniature Hobbyist and Lila the Mini Witch enjoyed them, and they painted them for a video as well. So guys, if you are in the market for some cool minis, there will be a link in the description, so check them out. And thank you Evernight for sponsoring this video. So, already you see how we are integrating both texture and saturation for different results. To add another principle on top of that, we are also playing with... You can already see this on the hammer. I wanted the front of the hammer and his sad face to be the standouts, since it's just such an interesting juxtaposition. And yes, I am using this word to sound very smart. Just look how weird it is. This guy is literal monster wielding a weapon of mass destruction, but instead of destroying stuff, he just stands there, all sad. Furthermore, you can play around with light so you can bend the reality a little bit. For example, you'll see me paint his face way lighter than the rest of the skin, because it's almost always the main focal point of the mini. At least if your mini doesn't have big and beautiful personality. Also, when it comes to his face, I do make it very light, but I don't bother making it perfectly smooth, because it's a troll after all, not a fashion model. However, it's certainly nowhere near as textured as the hammer. Either way, as I paint his red hair, I make it very light as well. Whenever you want to make something stand out, it's a good practice to concentrate light colors around it. On the contrary, when it comes to his hairy arms, you might think, hey look, those are just as hairy as Zumikito's arms. But more importantly, you might think that it's just as reflective as the hair on his head. But again, since I want your attention on his face, I won't make his arms too light to take away the focus, even though it would make it more correct. And this is true pretty much for the rest of the model. I made sure to paint the weapon and the head first, because they are this sort of ceiling when it comes to the highest value on the mini. On the other hand, his legs are gonna be quite dark, and the clothing will fall somewhere in between. Now, keeping all our mentioned principles in mind, we can further differentiate the leather parts of the clothing from the grey parts, by texturing it. By adding more irregular brushstrokes, we can do it quite easily. It's also the best to do this in the midtones rather than the lightest color, so it's more credible. As I continue further and further, unfortunately, you'll see me fuck up. This feather was supposed to be kinda glowing, but also not really? Perhaps I should mention that there is this box illustration which I used as an inspiration. In there, the feathers have this weird dark energy around them. Initially I thought I might pull it off as a glow effect, but I realized that one, I would have to make the surrounding parts darker, and two, it would be yet another point of interest. As it is, 2 points of interest are quite enough. And with the painted goblin, I guess it's kinda 2.5 points of interest? Doesn't matter. The thing is, it would be too much to make it stand out. So after I painted something else and actually finished it, I came back to the feather later to paint it properly. And this is yet another important principle. You know what? I always envied people who can go from point A to point B without any stops. And no, I am not talking about P-breaks on a road trip, but about the fact that someone is able to paint something without ever going back to fix anything. I, however, am not a painting demigod, so I do make mistakes. A lot of mistakes. So going back and forth is a second nature to me. And it's not like I come back to what I painted only when I see mistakes. Sometimes I feel like some parts of the miniature can be made lighter, smoother, more saturated, or whatever. And I don't shy away from adjusting them. Obviously, if I can paint things in one go, I go ahead and do that. But for me, it's very rare. I feel like miniature painting is a constant back and forth between different paints and brushstrokes until I am happy with the final result. I thought that recording the painting process for this guy will be a piece of cake because, well, it's a fucking huge miniature, so maybe I can show you everything easily. Turns out, not the case. Like, at all. So obviously you'll see me skip a lot of the process because I have recorded almost 10 hours of painting. And of course I've painted this guy for more than the 10 hours. But if you wanna see all of the recordings, it'll be on my Patreon. At some point I realized that the shoulder pads are quite light, which makes sense given that they are metal, but it also made me push the hair highlights even further. I do this by adding some pure white in the reflection. So that is another example of me coming back to something that is already painted. When it comes to the little goblin, there are 3 things I wanna point out. First, I made him much darker overall, so he isn't in the spotlight. The only exception, quite obviously, is his face. Second thing is that I still textured the leather, so the viewer has easy time identifying it as such. So it's definitely true that differentiating the textures is still useful even for stuff out of focus. And the third thing is that it's a good idea to have something interesting to show from all angles of the miniature. It just happens so that the goblin has this shield or badge thingy around his waist, so I put there some more effort as well as into the feather so it looks nice from the back. Especially since the back angle doesn't really have any clear focal point. Following these 4 principles, I was able to tackle this miniature, even though it's very different from what I usually paint. And if you are struggling with your minis, I think that these 4 principles will help you and guide you along the way. And by the way, have you seen how thick of a layer have I used here? That's because you can absolutely apply thick paint on your miniatures, but if you do that, you have to keep one thing in mind. But I talk about that in this video, so check it out. And see you there.